You're watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. Your host, Michael. On a Thursday evening, we're continuing our lecture series here by Louis Dizon on Basics of Biblical Hebrew. And in this lecture, we're going to be doing, I believe it's the 8th lecture, we're going to be going over verbs. But before we dive in, let me first welcome you back to the show. Louis, how are you?
Well, it's great to be back. I believe this is my first appearance for the year of 2022.
For 2022, that's right. You're right. I didn't even think about that. That's right. Well, one of many, hopefully, Lord willing.
Lord willing.
Yeah, so, All right, well, go ahead, take it over from here, however you want. And if you want to share your screen, by the way, just let me know and I can add it.
Yep, let me set it up. You got it. There we go. Okay. So, as is customary for these lectures, we will begin by doing some of the exercises that are connected with the previous chapter. So we did chapter 10 last time, and that covered numbers. So this time we're going to do the translation exercise that's connected to chapter 10. So these are some selections from the book of Genesis, and as we learn numbers, here are some that will be coming up. And so we're going to read verse by verse, and then I will translate and give a brief explanation whenever necessary. So here are some verses. So Genesis 28, verse 5. וישלח יצחק את יעקב על אף עשיו אחיו וילק פדנה ארם והוא ועת ההוא יעקב. היה בן 77 שנה וילק אל לבן אחי רבקה עם יעקב ועשיו. So this is about Jacob's wives, and it says, and Isaac sent Jacob. So he sent Vaishlach from the verb shalach, and Yitzchak is the one who sends Jacob to al-af Esav. It's like away from Esau. So this is the story of him fleeing from Esau. Esau, his brother. And he walked, Vayelech, from Halach, Padana Aram. So, Padan Aram, that's a place in the Bible. And we discussed the directional hey. You can see it attached to the word Padan here, or Padena. And Hu Va'et Hahu Yaakov. And at that time, Jacob was 70 years son of. So this is how you indicate age, if you recall. Ben Sheva v'shiv'im shana, the son of 7 and 70 years. So, or in other words, 77 years old. Vayelech, so he walked to Laban, or Laban, the brother of Rivka, or Rebecca, the mother of Jacob and Esau. So this is, there are a bunch of what we call construct chains here. So the brother of Rebecca, the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now Genesis 29, verse 20. Ye'ehav et Rachel bat Lavan, ve'avod Yaakov berachel 7 shanim, vayihyu be'enav kayamim acharim. And he loved Rachel, this daughter of Laban. So the implied subject here, of course, is Jacob, but he's not explicitly mentioned. And Jacob served for Rachel 7 years, and it was in his eyes as but a few days. So, sorry, I said acharim, it's actually achadim. By kayamim achadim, it was as if it were just a few days. And we have a little note here that says that this plural form of one is used to indicate a few. So remember, achad is the word, or echad is the word for one. So achadim, the plural form, is used to mean a few. Verse 23. Vahi ka'asher ba hayom vayikach Lavan et Leah bito tachat Rachel vayiten ota elav vayavo elea. And so it was, Vayhi comes from Haya, just as the day came, and he took, and Laban took Leah, his daughter, instead of Rachel. Those of you who know the Bible story know how this ends up. And he gave her to him, and he went to her. So we got a bunch of verbs here. Vaikach from lakach, to mean to take. You have vaiten from Natan, to give. You have yavo from ba'a, which means to go. And then verse 24, vaiten Lavan et zilpa shifchato le Leah le shifcha. And Laban gave Zilpah, his maidservant, to Leah to be her maidservant. Verse 28. Vayimale Yaakov shvu'a Leah vaiten lo Lavan et Rachel bito lo leisha. And Jacob fulfilled a week. Leah, let me see. Yeah. And he gave him, and Laban gave him Rachel, his daughter to him as a wife. So a bunch of stuff happened in between, but the reader leaves that part out because it's not important for our exercise. Verse 29. Vaiten Lavan Rachel et Bilha shifchato la shifcha. And Laban gave to Rachel Bilha, his maidservant, to her, to be her maidservant. Once again, we got the word yiten, which is the Vaiktol form for Natan. Vayavo Yaakov el Rachel vayehav et Rachel milea vayavod imo od sheva shanim acharot. And Jacob went to Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. So remember, we learned comparatives a while back. So the min or me can sometimes be used as a comparative. So you might say, and he loved Rachel from Leah, but that's awkward. It should be idiomatically rendered as she loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with him again 7 more years, rather. Now I get to the children of Leah. Chapter 29, verse 31 onwards. Vayar Adonai ki Yaakov ahav et Rachel milea, vaiten Leah banim v'Rachel akara. And the Lord saw. So Vayar, this comes from Ra'ah, it's the Vayiktal form. Ki Yaakov, that Jacob loved. Ahav means to love. Rachel more than Leah, and he gave to Leah sons. And Rachel was barren. Akara is the word for barren here. Verse 32, Vatahar Leah, Vateled ben, Vatikrashmo Reuven, Ki Amra Ra'a Ito Adonai, Vaye'ehav Ito Ishi. And she conceived, and rather Leah conceived, and she bore a son. And she called his name Reuben, because she said, he saw me, the Lord saw me, and he loved me, my man, and my man loved me. So this is explaining the meaning behind the name Reuven. So Ra'ah and the word Ben are sort of both found in the name Reuben, as you can see. A lot of these word plays make a lot more sense if you know Hebrew. Again, verse 33. Vatahar od, vateled ben, sheni, vatomer, Shama Adonai vayiten li gam et ze, vatikra shmo Shimon. So in English, and she conceived again, and she bore a second son, and she called his name, and she said, the Lord heard, and he gave me gam et ze, and he gave me again this. He also gave me this, and she called his name Shimon. Shimon, of course, comes from Shama, so it's like his name has to do with hearing. Verse 34, Vatahar od, vateled ben, shlishi, vatomer, vilave ishi elai, vatikra shmo Levi. And she conceived again a third son, and she said, my husband, or my man, has joined to me, and she called his name Levi, which is a wordplay from Yilave. Don't those names mean so much more once you understand the wordplay behind them? Verse 35. Vatahar od vateled ben revi'i vatomer ki tode et Adonai al ze vatikra shmo Yehuda vayola yalda od. And she bore again, and she conceived again, and she bore a fourth son. And she said, because you have praised the Lord, or Adonai, or because you have praised, because she has praised, rather. Remember that tav can mean both, depending on context. And because you've praised the Lord upon this, and she called his name Yehuda, which is a wordplay from Tode, and she did not conceive anymore, or she did not beget anymore. And then the children of Bilhah in chapter 30 rather. Vatere Rachel ki lo yalda leYaakov. And Rachel saw, this from Ra'ah to see, that she did not beget to Jacob. Verse 4. Vatiten lo et Bilha shivchata leisha vayavo elav Yaakov. And she gave to him Bilhah, her maidservant, as a wife. And he went to her, and Jacob went to her. Notice something here. Jacob, the subject, is at the end of this clause, after the verb and after the object. So you got a very unusual verb, object, subject clause here. Why is that the case? you'll find out later. There's actually a rule as to why the subject occurs last in this clause. For now, you just need to know that that is the thing that happens. Verse 5. Vatahar bilha, vateled liakov ben. And Bilha conceived, and she bore to Jacob a son. Verse 6. Vatomer Rachel dan oti Elohim v'gam shama b'koli v'yiten li ben v'tikra shmo Dan. And Rachel said, the Lord has judged me. So Dan has to do judging. So God has judged me, rather. Elohim has judged me. And also he heard my voice, and he gave me a son, and he called his name Dan, from the verb dan here. You'll notice that there's only 2 consonants here. That's because it shortens. You don't have to worry about that for now. For now, you just need to know the fact that sometimes verbs will contract, so one of the consonants will disappear. Verse 7. Vatahar od vateled bilha shifchat Rachel ben sheni leYaakov. And she conceived again, and Bilha bore the maidservant of Rachel bore a second son to Jacob. Verse 8. Vatomer Rachel ki benaftule Elohim niftala im Leah achota v'tikra shmo Naphtali. And Rachel said, because the wrestlings, so this is the word for wrestlings, the wrestlings of God to wrestle with Leia. It's kind of weird it's kind of difficult to render in English, but it has to do as when the wrestlings of God wrestled with Leia, and then her sister, and then she called his name Naphtali, from the word naftule, or naftul rather. Verse 9. Batere Leah ki lo yalda od v'titen et zilpa shifchata leYaakov leisha. And Leah saw that she did not bear anymore, or bear again, and she gave Zilpah, her maidservant, to Jacob as a wife. And Zilpah, vateled Zilpah shifchat Leah leYaakov ben. And Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, begat to Jacob a son. Vatomer Leah begad v'tikra et shmo Gad. And Leah said in Gad. I'm not exactly sure how to in fortune. I see. So it's not a common vocab word, which I had to look it up. And she called his name Gad after that word. Verse 12. Vateled Zilpah shifchat Leah ben sheni leYaakov. And Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, begat a second son to Jacob. Verse 13. Vatomer Leah v'yiashru oti v'tikra et shmo Asher. And Leah said, Yash. So they have declared as blessed. I've been declared as blessed, or he has declared me as blessed. Actually, this is a third person plural, so it's like they have declared me as blessed, but really that should be rendered as a passive. I have been declared as blessed. And I'll discuss why this is the case later on. There's actually a rule for that. And she called his name Asher from Yashru. Let me see how many more do we have. Yep. All right, we got more. Chapter 30, verse 17. Vayishma Elohim el Leah vatahar vateled Yaakov ben Hamishi. And God heard Leah, and she conceived and bore to Jacob a fifth son. Verse 18. Vatomer Leah ki natan Elohim sachar la al asher natna shifchata leisha. Vatika shmo Yisachar. And Leah said, because God gave me sakar, gave me a wage to her, upon which she gave her maidservant as a wife, and she called his name Yisachar. So the name has to do with that word sachar here. Verse 19. Vatahar od Leah vateled ben Shishi Yaakov. And she conceived again. Leah conceived again, rather, and she bore a sixth son to Jacob. Verse 20. Vatomer Leah ki zil yizbul oto isha ki yalda lo shisha vanim vatika et shmo Zvulun. And Leah said, because he has exalted her as a wife, for she begat to him six sons, and she called his name Zvulun from Yizbul. So it has to do with exaltation. Verse 21. Va'achar yalda bat vatika et shma Dina. So, and finally, she begat a daughter, and she called her name Dina. Notice that this time the name is not explained. There's no preface explaining why she's called Dina. However, we do get a little bit of a hint. If you remember, the name Dan was given to one of the earlier sons. Let's go back up here. So Dan Oti, and then he was named Dan. And Dan here means judging. Dina has the same root. So there's the connotation of judgment behind her name. All right, and now we get to the children of Rachel. Verse 22. Vayizkor Elohim et Rachel, vayishma Elea, vayten la banim. And God remembered Rachel, and he listened to her, or he heard her, and he gave her sons. Verse 23. Vatahar vateled ben, vatomer asaf Elohim et cherpati. And she conceived, and she bore a son, and she said, the Lord God has added to my reproach, or actually has gathered my reproach. He's gathered. So, Vatika et shmo Yosef ki amra Yosef Adonai li ben Acher. And she called his name Yosef from Asaph, because she said, may the Lord add to me another son. So there's a little bit of double entendre here. So You have the word Yosef, means may he add, and then the word Asaph, which means he gathered. And then the name Yosef or Joseph sort of alludes to both. It primarily has to do with adding up, but the gathering um, connotation is also there. And then you get to verse 25. Vayhi ka'asher yalda Rachel et Yosef ve'avod Yaakov im Lavan od shesh shanim acherot litzono. And so it was, just as Rachel begat Joseph, and Jacob served with Laban again 6 years, 6 more years, or 6 other years, for his flock. So he worked. So that's 20 years in total if you add it up. And then we skip some verses. We head straight to verse 34. V'kol hayamim asher Yaakov bepadan Aram hayu 20 shana vayashav Yaakov artsa Knaan uva'et hahu Yaakov ben 97 shana. So this is Jacob talking. And all the days which, sorry, not Jacob talking, it's the narrator. And all the days which Jacob was in Padan Aram were 20 years. So that's 7 years for Leia, 7 years for Rachel, and 6 years for the flock. And Jacob dwelt in the land, towards the land of Canaan. So Yashav can mean to dwell or to sit, depending on the context. And then Artsa, there's the directional hey attached to the word Aretz. He dwelt in the land of Canaan, and in that time, Jacob was the son of 20 and 90 and 7 years. Or in other words, 97 years old. Sorry, did I say 6 and then 7? 97 years old. So he was already old by the time he left. Verse 16. Vayhiu b'derech Ephata hi Bet Lechem v'teled Rachel v'tamot. And so it was on the way to Ephrata, on the way of Ephrata, and it is in Bethlehem. It is Bethlehem, and Rachel begat, and she died. So you can see that the progression is very abrupt here. She began and she died. The original text had more detail. This is just simplification. Verse 18. Vayhi be'et hahu fahi vatikra shmo ben Oni. And so it was in that time, and she called his name the son of Ben Oni. I don't remember what it means. But the rest of the verse says, V'aviv karali Benyamin. And his father called his name Benyamin, which means the son of my right hand. Son of the right hand, rather. Verse 22. Vayhiu bnei Yaakov shneim asar. And it was the sons of Jacob were 12. So you got the 12 sons at this point. Verse 27. Vayavo Yaakov el Yitzchak aviv Mamre Kiryat Arba hi Chevron asher yashvu sham Avraham v'Yitzchak. And Jacob went to Yitzhak. Jacob went to Isaac, his father, in Mamre, or Kiryat Arba, and it is in Hebron. So you got a bunch of place names here, which is where they dwelt there, Abraham and Isaac. That's where Abraham and Isaac dwelt. And then we're almost done. 2 more verses, and we'll get to the grammar section of this presentation. Vayihyu yamei Yitzchak ma'at shana ushmonim shana. And so it was. And so the days of Isaac were 100 years. 100 years and 80 years. 180 years here. So the word Shana is repeated twice. So 100 years and 80 years. And finally, chapter 37, verse 2. ויוסף הוא בן 17 שנה כאשר אחי יוסף מכרו אותו למצרים. And Joseph, he was 17 years old, just as the brothers of Joseph sold him to Egypt. That's not exactly what chapter 37, verse 2 says, but it's a summary of the entire chapter. So there we go. You've got your translation exercises for the day, and we will, hopefully this is helpful for you. You learn how to translate, or you watch me do it, and you're able to follow along, see how each specific word is translated. Now we're going to get to the verbs. So we learned quite a bit about nouns, pronouns, numbers, but that's just one part of it. A major part of learning any language, and Hebrew is no exception, is learning the verbal system. Every language family does verbs very differently. So if you've ever picked up, say, Latin or Greek, you may have learned that those languages have fairly complex verbal systems. The Semitic languages, including Hebrew, but also Arabic, Aramaic, etc., their verbal system is different. It's not quite as chart heavy as Latin, but there are certain salient features that are worth noting, and you need to keep in mind so that you can navigate them. And these verbs can be tricky as well if you don't familiarize yourself with the rules. So let's talk a little bit about sentences. So in any language, complete expression thought is comprised of a subject and a verb. So an example here is the sentence he heard. You got the subject he, and you got the verb heard. And that can basically be a complete expression thought in and of itself. We may add things to it. For example, he heard a loud noise. So now you add an object to that sentence. But remember that the subject and the verb are the essential parts. And when we talk a little bit about clauses a little later in this chapter, you'll see that you can have complete clauses that are basically just a single word, and that single word already conveys both the subject and the verb in it. Verbs have mood, and this is true of verbs across all languages. And in Hebrew, the verbs are active, passive, and reflexive. This roughly corresponds to other languages as well. In Greek, you have active, passive, and middle. It's the same concept. So the difference between the three moods has to do with what is being focused on. So let's look at this. Look at these three pictures. You'll notice that something is happening in each one, and then we have a caption for each one. Number one, the man kicked the target. The verb kicked is in the active mood. And so here, the focus is on the man, the one doing the action. And here you have another image. The caption says, the target was kicked by the man. Notice the verb is now in the passive mood, and this indicates that what is being focused on is the thing being acted upon, i.e. the target. And then number three, the man vaulted himself into the air. So this is reflexive. The subject and the object of the verb are the same thing. The man makes the act, and the man is the one being acted upon at the same time. So the mood conveys what is the focus of that particular clause. And of course, we use mood all the time to change the framing of the things we say. For example, saying that I made a mistake is very different from saying a mistake was made. In the former, we're concentrating on the fact that it is I, me, that made that mistake. Whereas in the latter, we are focusing on the fact that a mistake was made, and we're trying to shift the attention away from me as the one who made it. And other than the mood, you also have a bunch of things that are conveyed by the Hebrew verb, and those are the number of the verb, the gender of the verb, and also the tense. It's more of really aspect. We'll get to that later. How all those things are conveyed is through what we refer to as preformatives and suffixes. You may remember the terms prefix and suffix. The concept is a little bit similar, but not quite the same, and I'll explain in a second. So remember that every Hebrew verb has the three-letter root. Here you have the word gadal, and that gimel dalet lamed root conveys becoming great, to be great. Now you can add a letter before and after it, and that will change whether it's the subject is a feminine or a masculine, a singular or plural. And if it's added before gadal, it is a preformative. If it's added after, it's called a subformative. And it's not a prefix or a suffix. Remember that, because prefixes and suffixes can be added onto it as well. And we'll see examples of a verb that has all of the above. So I want to note the root is the core meaning of the verb. We already discussed that briefly. If you can remember what each three-letter root means, you can actually predict what a word means the first time you encounter it, before you've even looked up what it means in a lexicon. Because just seeing the three-letter roots already tells you that it has to do with a certain action. So, for example, if you see that it starts with Gimel Dalet Lamed, you already know it has something to do with becoming great. If you see a word and it has the Kaf Tav Bet root in it, you already know it has to do with writing before you've even looked up its exact meaning. But apart from root, the other major part of a verb that you need to know is the stem. In Hebrew, this is what we call a binyan. So the stems are collectively referred to as the binyanim. So this textbook does not use the term binyanim. but I am going to use it because it is standard use in Hebrew, and you need to be familiar with the term. So the 7 binyanim are kal, nifal, piel, pual, hitpael, hifil, and hofal. So all of them, with the exception of kal, have tell you what the basic form of the verb is going to be. So kal means simple or basic. And it's called that because it is the most basic form of any verb. And almost all verbs have a kal form. There's a few that don't, but the vast majority do. And once you start adding these vowels and the pre-formatives to it, you form the other forms. Nifal, piel, pual, hitpael, hifil, hofal. And there are actually other verb stems besides the 7 basic ones. For example, there's also the hitpolel, but and that is a verb that gets used quite a bit for the I believe it's the verb for prayer, but they're significantly rarer than the 7 basic stems, so they are barely discussed. Most Hebrew grammars focus on these 7 because they're the ones you're mostly gonna encounter. So just think of any verb. All right, so let's say katal. Katal means he killed. All right, so if we were to take katal and we were to attach, change its binyan, it would be niktal, it would be hitel, kutal, hitkatel, hiktil, and hoktal. Now, the word katal does not occur in all of those forms. I am simply saying that as sort of like a hypothetical illustration of what any given verb would look like in all of those different binyanim. And there are chapters dedicated to each one of these in the textbook. Most for the next several sessions, we're going to focus exclusively on the kal because that's the basic form. And then once we've mastered the kal, we're going to look at all the others binyanim. And you'll see that the other binyanim follow the same basic rules as the kal, just with different forms. And here's a table. Take a quick, good look at it because it will tell you what each binyan conveys. So kal is an active or stative verb. PL is a causative, stative, or active stative verb. Hifil is also causative. This causes a state, this causes an action. So he caused someone to be great, or he caused to hear. And then in the passive form, you have the nifal. It's both passive and reflexive. That's the basic one. You have causative passives. So the pual is a causative passive for a stative. A causative passive for an action verb is hofal. And then a reflexive stative is a hitpael. That's a lot to take in. Don't worry about it. We will eventually tackle all of these binyanim one at a time. For now, you just need to know they exist. You need to be able to identify them when they come up in a reading. But for next several sessions, we're going to concentrate on this guy on the top left, the kal. So we're going to be best friends with the kal over the next few sessions. So this is where we get to the conjugation of a verb. So how we conjugate something is, we indicate whether it's a perfect or an imperfect or a vav consecutive perfect or a vav consecutive imperfect. This is a mouthful, so we usually just say vaiktol and the katal form. Notice that we use katal Vayiktol, the verb to kill. For that, that's become basic in Hebrew grammar. Don't ask why. I'm not entirely sure myself. But be it that as it may, that's the term that we tend to use. Vayiktol and vakatal. Sorry, this is vakatal. This is vayiktol. The other term we can use for these are preterites. So they are preterite forms. And if you have been reading any of the narrative portions of the Hebrew Bible, you've already noticed them quite a bit. And the verbal conjugation includes this bit of information, but it also includes the stem. So you have, for example, the Kal perfect, the Kal imperfect, the Kal Vav consecutive perfect, the Val consecutive imperfect, etc. So the textbook has a very neat explanation for it. Imagine you got a little computer screen. It has the binyanim in it. And when you click it, a drop-down menu indicates all the possible forms of the Kal. You got Kal perfect, imperfect, jussive, imperative, participle, infinitive. And we'll get to all those eventually. So those are the two main elements of verb conjugation. And then once you've learned the mood, which is conveyed by the binyan. So once you know the binyan and the aspect of it, this is the verbal aspect. Up next, we need to learn the big three, which is person, gender, and number. So if you understand English grammar, this is fairly straightforward. First person, the one speaking. Second person, the one being spoken to. Third person, someone other than the first two. First person is I or we. Second person is you. And of course, in English, you can be singular or plural. Every other language in the world besides English differentiates between the singular, second person singular and second person plural. But modern English does not. We used to back when we used thou and ye, but we just use you for both. And then third person, it's he, she, they. And comes in singular and plural. You may remember, I believe I discussed this briefly, that in Hebrew nouns, there's also a dual form. There's no dual form for Hebrew, so what tends to happen is I can't remember off the top of my head any instance where a subject is in the dual form. But typically, hypothetically, if you did encounter one, you would pair it with a plural verb. So now we know the things we have to be on the lookout for in a verb. You've got the binyan, or stem rather, and after that you've got the aspect, which is perfect, imperfect, imperative, etc. And then you've got person. And now the other two are gender and number. So gender is masculine plural. Unlike Greek, unlike English, unlike German, there is no neuter in Hebrew. Everything is grammatically either masculine or feminine. So inanimate objects are grammatically masculine or feminine. And you can usually tell because if it has a verb attached to it, it will have to subject verb has to agree, or there could also be the hey at the end, and if something has a hey, you know that it's meant to be taken as a feminine. So gender, number, person, aspect, and binyan. So all these things are important to know when we parse a verb. So verb parsing is a very important part of translating any language. So let's look at this text of Genesis, all right? So let's grab the first verb that appears. What is the first verb in the Bible? bara, right? What is bara? It is a kal, perfect, third person, masculine, singular. If you look at the bottom left of my screen, Verbo already parses for you. When you're learning a language, it's good to manually write down. Every time, this is standard in a lot of language, Hebrew and Greek language tests. Every time you run into a verb, you have to parse the verb. So you give all that information. So it is called perfect third person masculine singular. Its root form is bara. It means to create. And if you translate this, it'll be he created. Let's check another one. Haita over there. I'm not gonna highlight it so that I can do this off the top of my head. So haita is kal, perfect, third person feminine singular from haya, which means to be. It means she was or it was. And there you go, I'm correct. So we're going to do this for a whole bunch of verbs towards the end. We'll get to that. We'll come back to this. Don't worry. So now that we know what the basic things to look out for, just remember these are the things you have to look out for: stem, conjugation, person, gender, number. 5 things. Now we're gonna learn how to identify them, and that is through the preformatives and subformatives that we just mentioned. So let's take shamar again. Now we can change its form into yishmaru. All right. So by adding the yod hirek as a preformative and the shurek vav as the subformative, we've turned this into a third person plural. They will keep. Sorry, a third person imperfect plural. They will keep. And apart from that, you also add prefixes and suffixes. I mentioned these are different from these preformative and subformative, and you will see why. So let's take yishmaru, they will keep. And here we expand on it by prefixing ha and then suffixing nu. So ha yishmarunu. This is actually a complete sentence already. The ha at the beginning indicates that it's a question, and the nu at the end indicates that the object of the verb is first person plural, us. You translate it, it is will they keep us? So from to keep, you get they will keep, and then a full sentence, will they keep us? This is the magic of the Hebrew language. You got an entire sentence conveyed in a single word. And that's the great thing about Hebrew. It's very economical in the amount of space that it fills up. And there are many more fun examples of this. So another thing to note, vocalic ending or a vocalic subformative or suffix is any ending that begins with a vowel. So shamru is an example of it. So when you got a vocalic ending, it does some things to the verb that's attached to it. Notice, for example, that the mem, it was shamar, but the patach here turned into a shva. Why is that? Well, we have the vowel changes that we discussed in chapter 5 to thank for that. And we're going to briefly touch upon that again at the end of this. Because this now becomes part of, this actually becomes, it becomes 2 separate syllables at this point. Let me get the draw on screen here. Shamru. It's not shamaru, it's shamru. So, and then a consonantal formative by contrast, is one that begins with a consonant. Shamar ta, shamar te, chem. So the first part of it is the tav or the kaf, which is a consonant. And then same thing with preformatives. You have a preformative vowel. So that's the vowel that stands under the preformative consonant. So yishmor, the hirek underneath the yod, is the preformative vowel. And then finally you have the theme vowel. So it's a vowel that gets added to certain forms of a verb to distinguish it from other related forms. In this case, the holem over here is how you know that this is a third person imperfect. Sorry, third person singular imperfect. And verbs have another use in Hebrew sentences, and that is to help indicate clauses. They serve as guideposts for breaking sentences into smaller units of thought. This is where we get into clauses. So a sentence can be made up of multiple clauses. Now, the difference between a sentence and a clause is that a sentence always conveys a complete thought, whereas a clause may or may not convey a complete thought. So you have, if you know your English grammar, you already know the terms independent and dependent clauses. The same concept exists in Hebrew, although we use slightly different terminology. So we use subordinating clauses for the dependent clauses, for example. Unlike English, Hebrew allows a sentence to have an implied verb. So in English, the verb is always explicit, whereas in Hebrew it can sometimes be implicit. Here's a great example. Adonai Eloheinu, the Lord is our God. Is, of course, is a linking verb. A lot of times in Hebrew, there's no explicit word for it. It's implied. So you can just imagine an invisible is floating between Adonai and Eloheinu. In English, we can't do that. We can't just say the Lord, our God. You have to say the Lord is our God. And one of the neat things about verbs is that a single verb by itself can already be a complete sentence. We already saw an example of that in above. Yishmaru, Hayishmarunu. In English, we do the same thing applies. This is how you know verb is the most important part of a sentence, because the verb is the only part of the only sentence part that can stand on its own as a complete sentence. And that happens in commands in English when we tell someone run, sleep, move. That one sentence verb already conveys a complete sentence there. And the same thing applies in Hebrew. So a clause needs two things. It needs a subject and it needs a verbal idea. So the subject does not need to be now these two things don't need to be explicit both at the same time. You can have an implicit verb such as in Adonai Eloheinu. You can also have an implicit subject. So remember that when you conjugate a verb, there's already a built-in person to it. So if you have a clause where there's no subject explicitly mentioned, that's then the subject is implied within the verb itself. By the way, this is called a nominal clause or a verbless clause. So that's a type of clause that has no explicit verb in it. Now, there's also a phrase which is different from a clause. So it provides a unit of thought that complements the clause and does not need a subject-verb component. So he went is a phrase. So the phrase to the temple Here's the example. And a clause can, so that phrase is part of a clause, and a clause can be part of a sentence. And a clause can be a complete sentence by itself, or it can be part of it. So here's an example. You've got 3 sentences here. He arrived. He proclaimed the prophecy to the people. He received the sent prophecy from God. Each of these is a sentence in and of itself. All right? And each one expresses a complete thought. But let's say you wanted to combine all these into one sentence. It would look something like this. When he arrived, he proclaimed the prophecy to the people that he had received from God. The way this is phrased, only one of these is an independent clause, and that's this one. He proclaimed the prophecy to the people. How do you know it's an independent clause? Well, imagine these 2 clauses didn't exist, and you had just this. Well, this by itself is already a complete thought. It can stand on its own as a sentence, whereas if I said, when he arrived, that's an incomplete thought. You need to complete that. Or if I said that he had received from God, you'd probably be thinking, he received what from God? So these are subordinate clauses. They are subordinated to the main clause, which is this one. So main clause, subordinate clauses. And those correspond to what we refer to in English as dependent and independent clauses. How do I identify clauses? Well, there are some rules. So every verb stands in its own clause. So as we will soon see, you get exactly 1 verb per clause. If you see a bunch of verbs together, that means that each one is a clause on its own. The verbs preceded by a conjunction begin a new clause. So remember we talked about the vaiktal form and the vakatal form. Those are always the beginning of a new clause. Vashamra, and she will guard. That's an example of it. The one exception to the rule is if it's a negation. Valo shamra, and she did not guard. So in this case, the va is attached to lo, so shamra becomes the second word in there. But this is one whole verbal phrase, so you can think of them as such. Subordinate clauses can be identified by the fact that they begin with certain keywords. So some of those keywords include asher, who or which, ki, which means because or that, lamaan, so or that, and then pen, lest. So if you run into these 4 words, you know that you're dealing with a subordinate clause right there. And then finally, this is a little bit more advanced, but Masoretic accents are also used to indicate clauses. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because, well, first of all, the Masoretic accent markers are added later on. So you have these things right here. Actually, no, that's not the example. Here, you'll see these. Yeah, those are the cancellation marks. Those can be used to indicate separate phrases. Actually, we should talk about the accent markers. So the accents mark the rhythm and flow of the text. So generally, when you see a word with an accent marker, it tends to mark the beginning of a new clause. Here, not always, but often it does. Anyway, so the accent marks are also used for cancellation purposes. So here you have cancellation marks, and sometimes they're used to mark the beginnings of phrases or clauses. This gets a little bit tricky because if you take these out, it becomes ambiguous sometimes, where one clause begins and another ends, and you can have a certain, and I've run into this in the Psalms particularly. There's a few of examples of these in the Psalms where you have a certain verse and the accent markers indicate that a new clause begins at a certain point, but without the accent markers, um, you don't know where exactly the next clause begins. It becomes ambiguous. And then if you look at the Septuagint, it tends to go a different route than the Masoretic text in identifying where a clause begins and ends there. That's more advanced stuff. Don't worry about that. Um, if we ever start talking about textual criticism, maybe that's a good time to discuss it. But that's outside the scope of um, this lesson. And I won't dwell on the accent markers anymore because you don't need to learn them, at least not for learning basic Hebrew. You can if you really want to, but I find it's not particularly important for them, for a Hebrew learner to know them. Now let's talk about word order. So within a clause, words tend to fall into specific orders. So sometimes you have, similar to English, a sentence or a clause that is subject, verb, object. So if I say I ate the bread, I is the subject, ate is the verb, bread is the object. But in Hebrew, it's not always subject, verb, object. In fact, a lot of cases it's not. In Vaiktol, in phrases that begin with Vaiktol, for example, those tend to be verb, subject, object, and there's a lot of those in the prose sections of the Hebrew Bible. Example of verb, subject, object. Zachru et Adonai. So they remember the Lord. So you begin with Zachar, and then you have the implied subject, they, and then you have the object, et Adonai, the Lord. How do we know he is the object? You have the direct definite object marker, et. Now, here's a similar example with the explicit subject. Zachru ha'anashim et Adonai. Zachru, they remembered, ha'anashim, the men, et Adonai, the Lord. So the men remembered the Lord. Verb, subject, object. How do we know that this is the subject? Because of its positioning, and also because the only other noun in this clause has the definite direct object marker. Oh, but wait, aren't there cases where the object comes before the subject? The answer is yes, and we will see one shortly. You scroll down here, Zachru oto ha'anashim. The men remembered him. Okay, contrast that with above here, Zachru ha'anashim. Notice something? Zachru ha'anashim et Adonai. So notice here, the subject is between the verb and the object is actually in the middle. You have verb, object, subject. And here you have verb, subject, object. And the reason for that is because when the object of a sentence appears as a pronoun, the word order shifts. So when it's a pronoun, it comes after the verb and before the subject. Here's another example. Contrast Vayomer Avraham el Yeha El Elohim. I think that's a typo. Supposed to say El Elohim. So Abraham spoke to God, said to God. Whereas here, Abraham said to him, Vayomer elav Avraham. Verb, object, subject. And he said to him, Abraham. Because it's a pronoun in these two cases, it's been pushed forward to just after the verb and before the subject. So take note, in Hebrew, word order is variable. You sometimes have subject, verb, object. A lot of times you have verb, subject, object, and in a few cases, usually with pronouns, it's verb, object, subject. So a few other things. So most of the time, the related words agree with gender and number. So a feminine noun should have a feminine verb. A singular noun should have a singular verb. Here's an example. Vatikrash mo Yehuda. And she called his name Judah. You know Judah is not the subject of this sentence because Judah is masculine and Tikra is feminine. So whoever the subject of Batikra is, she has to be feminine. In this case, she's not explicitly stated, but you have the implied she here. There's a few cases where you have a singular noun with a plural verb. So there are the exceptions to the rule always. One of those rare exceptions is the word zera, which means seed. Now, it's a singular noun, but sometimes it's used to refer to a collective. And in the context where it's used to refer to a collective, it gets attached to a plural verb. So, as it says here, the verb sometimes does not agree with the subject of the clause because the masculine verb is used as a default gender. So, yeah, so those are rare exceptions. Vast majority of the time you have subject-verb agreement. And then there's one other interesting phenomenon in Hebrew called the impersonal or the indefinite subject. So we do this in English as well. We say, for example, they say the movie is great. Well, who's they? They. There's no one specific person or group of people in particular. We're just saying people in general say the movie is great. And Hebrew does the same thing. Genesis 11:9 is a great example. Kara Shma Bavel. So literally, he called its name Babel. Well, who called its name Babel? No one in particular. Someone out there called Babel. Just when you encounter something like this, it's best to just translate it as a passive. Its name was called Babel. So, and here we already discussed the clauses that are joined together by conjunction vav. So we mentioned before that the conjunctive vav often begins a clause, so that becomes one of the ways that you can tell that a new clause is beginning. So what we learned that the typical translation of vav is end. However, that is not always the case. There are going to be times when the conjunction vav can be translated as but, or so then, or so that, or in order that, or now. Which one is the best translation to use? There's a bit of discretion involved there. First, you have to look at the context, and then you have to think about how you want to express it idiomatically in English. And a great example of that is the second verse of the Bible, right? Genesis 1:2. V'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'vohu, right? And the earth was formless and void. Well, instead of saying and the earth was formless and void, you can also say now the earth was formless and void, or so the earth was formless and void, etc. But if you're not sure which one to use, using and is generally a safe bet. In fact, the vast majority of the time, you can get away with translating the as just and. You can use the other possible translations if you're trying to convey it more idiomatically. So think of the Hebrew Bible as a comic book. So I've heard Hebrew described as a pictorial language. And there's some truth to that. If you think of the Hebrew Bible, especially the prose parts, as one big comic book, each clause is sort of like a panel within that comic. So one clause is one panel, and then you get to the next clause, and that's its own panel. And each one has a verb, a subject, and a verb. So a different action occurs in each of those panels. So the tip here is when you read Hebrew, try to create a picture of the action in your mind in the order the Hebrew author presents it. So the word order exists for a reason. It tells you how the sentence should appear in your mind. Every time as each word is introduced, that particular element is introduced to your mind as well. And that's the end of chapter 11. We'll cover chapters 12 and 13 in the next session, but one last thing I want to do before we close off is I want to revisit the first 9 verses of Genesis. All right. So as you can see here, I've underlined each clause. So each underline represents one clause, and then alternating colors to indicate alternating clauses. And we'll run into a few subordinate clauses, and I'll point those out as we go along. So what we'll do, we will identify the subject and the verb for each of these clauses. First, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What is the subject? It is Elohim. What is the verb? Bara. So, and how do we parse that? It is a call, third person, masculine singular. And I'm only going to parse the first few verbs that we will run into. In the future, we're going to parse every single one of them, but so that it doesn't get too tedious for now, we're only going to do the first few. So we have verb and subject. And then you have the object, the heavens and the earth. And then next clause, V'haaretz hayta tohu v'vohu. So you got the subject and the earth, v'haaretz. You have the verb hayta, and we parse that as call perfect, third person feminine, singular, from haya, which means to be. And it became formless and void. So there's no object here, it's just describing the subject. And then you've got the next clause, V'choshek al panei tehom. Subject is choshek. The verb is not explicit here. This is one of those verbless clauses we talked about. So there should be an is here, or was, and the earth and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the next clause, Varuach Elohim merachefet al panei hamayim. So, in the Spirit of God, that's the subject. The verb is merachefet. And merachefet is a PL participle. And it is feminine singular. Comes from the verb rachaf, meaning to hover. So the Spirit means hovering, basically. That's how you translate this. And then upon the face of the water. So this is an indirect object because direct. So you know that the direct objects have et attached to them. Indirect objects have a preposition before them. Not always. Sometimes direct objects have prepositions attached to them. But in this case, this indicates an indirect object. Vayomer Elohim. All right. Vayomer. This is the preterite or the Vaiktol form that we talked about. It has the verb consecutive. It is a kal, third person masculine singular from Amar. So this means he said. So God said. You got the verb, you got the subject. There's no object here. Yehi or, may light be. Yehi is the verb here, and then because it's an imperative. It's a little bit different. Or is the thing that is, I guess you could say, the subject of the verb. And then vaihi or. Vaiktol again. Kal, third person masculine singular. I won't parse the subsequent verbs. This comes from haya, means to be, and became. And light became, and light, or rather, and light was. That's another clause. Next clause. Vayar Elohim et haor. And God. So we got the subject, Elohim. We got the verb, vayar, and then you have the object, et haor, the light. And then we run into our first subordinate clause. Remember, ki is one of the words that is used to indicate a subordinate clause. So here it is, ki tov, that it is good. It's a verbless clause. There's an implied is between ki and tov, so that it is good. And then next clause, vayavdel Elohim ben haor uven hachoshech. So we got again Elohim is the subject. The verb is vayavdel, and he separated the light and the darkness. So these are direct objects, but they have the preposition ben attached to them here. And then verse 5, next clause, Vayikra Elohim la'or v'lakosh. Sorry, so this is clause by itself. Elohim is the subject, Vayikra is the verb, and the object is or. Next clause, V'lachoshek kara laila. And the darkness he called night. So the implied subject is he. So it's not explicit here, but you can tell from the parsing of the verb he called. And the object is choshech, or darkness. Vahi erev. So erev is the subject, vahi is the verb. And then the next clause, vahi boker yom echad. So here again, boker is the subject, vahi is the verb. We'll do verses 6 to 8 and then we're done. We'll be done here. Vayomer Elohim. Once again, Elohim is the subject and Vayomer is the verb. And then the next clause, Yahi Rakia B'toch Hamayim. Okay, so let it be. That is the verb, and what is to be? Rakia. So I guess that you could say that is the subject. And there's the clause here, between the waters. Sorry, that's a phrase, prepositional phrase here. And then next clause, Vayhi mavdil ben mayim lamayim. So here's an interesting thing. The participle can sometimes function. Actually, yeah, here you've got a participle. The participle sometimes has sort of a noun or an adjective quality to it. So in this case, that's what mavdil is doing here. So even though that's technically a verb, it's not part of its own clause. Instead, it's part of the clause with the verb yahi as the main verb. And then verse 7, Vayas Elohim et harakia. So Elohim is the subject, Vayas, he made, is the verb, and then the object is et harakia, the expanse or the firmament. Next clause, Vayavdel ben hamayim. And he divided between the water. So the implied subject is he. The verb is vayavdel. The object is ben hamayim. And then asher is another one of those words that begins a subordinate clause. So you know asher mitakat larakia. That's a subordinate clause. And there's an implied is here. So it's again a verbless clause. In between the water, that's an extension of this clause here. So think of this as one big clause with two subordinate clauses attached to it. So the first subordinate clause is this. The second subordinate clause is asher me'al larakia. Same thing. Asher marks the beginning, and then there's an implied is here. And then the next clause, vahichen, and so it was. And this is the and this is the verb with the implied subject, he, it. Verse 8, one more verse. Vaikra Elohim larakia shamayim. God is the subject, Vaikra is the verb, and larakia is the object, with shamayim describing what the rakia is. And then two more clauses. Vahi erev, so subject, verb. And then vahi voker yom sheni. Again, subject, voker, verb, vahi. Yom sheni is just a further elaboration of that. So all of this gives you an idea of how Hebrew can be split up into separate clauses. And notice if you look closely and you pay attention to the parts of the sentence, you can easily break this up into clauses on your own. Just remember, every clause has a verb and a subject. And that is it for today. In our subsequent sessions, we are going to revisit the the vowel changes. That's chapter 12, and that's a short chapter. So we're also going to cover chapter 13, call perfects. So we're going to delve into the call stem, the call binyan, and we're going to cover the perfect form of it. So that is it. So let me stop sharing now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Louis. Very, very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And I imagine we'll be doing our 9th lecture here in probably about a month or so. But we'll talk off the air about scheduling that. But everybody look forward to that. And again, thank you so much, Louis, for taking your time out and doing this.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to do it for all of the people here who want to learn Hebrew.
Absolutely, and highly appreciated. And everybody, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what we're doing. And I think that's going to do it. We'll see you later. Till next time.